The only case is that the agent is self-sovereign, is created and let go into the wild, and they're not working for anyone. And in that scenario, that's terrifying. The total value and the amount of money that's spent on agents buying tokens is likely to be bigger than agents buying everything else combined. Because it's like, that's the lifeblood. An agent has to buy a token to run.
For a builder, what's scary is if Anthropic just works with Cloudflare and enable wallets to purchase on all these different websites. Do you think in a month, two large institutions just turn on the lights?
Personally, it's much more likely to be back and forth, bottoms up, new use cases from new players, and that large players adopt those. It's very rarely that something doesn't exist and then overnight in a month, now it exists at scale. The best way to understand agentic payments and where it's going is to just start making agentic payments. I've been trying to buy something, with an agent every day. How does it work? Where does it break? That's where the alpha is.
Right now in the agentic space, there's an ideological power struggle between stablecoins and fiat, and it's unclear who will actually command agentic commerce. Is it the incumbents, Visa, MasterCard, Stripe, or is it the crypto native rails such as USDC, Coinbase, Solana, etc.? Today, I'm here with Kai Sheffield, head of crypto at Visa, to help us navigate this landscape, as Visa actually is working in both of the spaces, on the crypto rail side and on the fiat side as a industry leader and incumbent. So Kai, tell us, if stablecoins are internet native money and agents are basically the internet native buyers, then where does the value accrue in this entire equation and stack?
Yeah, it's the $1 trillion question. I think it's so early that nobody knows, but I think a few principles that we have here are, we believe stablecoins are amazing next generation infrastructure, and the ability to have blockchain networks that can move value 24/7 across the world, that are programmable, that have a low barrier to entry to be able to spin up a wallet, interact with, I think is fundamentally amazing for the increasing the velocity of money, bringing more people into digital payments and the financial system. I think all of that is incredible. But on the other hand, we don't look at stablecoins and blockchains as payment networks. Payment networks are fundamentally different than payment infrastructure, because a payment network, it's not just about the technology, it's not just about the protocols, it's about the governance and the risk and the rules and the controls and what happens when things go wrong. And I think that's where, when we look at protocols like x402 and MPP, and we're incredibly excited about them, and we think that they're going to play a big role, we don't think that the protocol themselves is complete as a payment network. We think that there need to be layers built on top of these protocols, that can actually commercialize them and bring them, to many more people and customers. And I think today, by all means, like, agentic commerce just doesn't exist like at any scale. Like, we've got like the bones and the kind of the early foundations, but there's just so much more to be built on top of it. And so, I think that there's a massive opportunity, for new payment products, to be able to take what x402 and MPP have as a protocol sense and be able to commercialize and enable kind of networks with governance and trust and structure, that can actually move value on top of those protocols. So that's my initial take on it.
And okay, so this network layer, right, which you're saying is native to almost like these fiat card systems, right? Can you kind of differentiate where the value is in cards and then where the value is in stables? Because there's like, the way that people are thinking about this is it's almost one or the other, but you guys are at an interesting intersection where you're adopting both at the same time. And yeah, can you just help us understand more this network versus infrastructure piece?
Yeah, I think anytime people kind of position it as stable coins versus cards, it's just such like a zero-sum thinking at the very beginning of this potentially enormous new space, and we very much believe and that both stable coins and cards will play a major role in the future of agentic payments. I think there are perhaps different use cases and different client segments, but like increasingly we believe stablecoins are one of the best backend infrastructure pieces for payments. And cards and networks like Visa are going to continue to be one of the best front-end payment networks, that both consumers and increasingly agents, in the future will interact with. And so I think like the back-end piece of what stablecoins do is they actually enable money to move, and frictionless movement of money, and being able to do it 24/7, not having bank holidays, and doing it in a programmable way is great. But I think the missing piece is, as I mentioned before, it's the trust in the governance. It's knowing that, if I'm going to transact with a merchant, someone has vetted that merchant, someone is taking responsibility for that merchant. If something goes wrong, there's going to be some way that I can, get my money back, or some way that prevents that merchant from continuing to scam other people. And so I think there's both this trust element as a consumer. When I see a merchant that accepts Visa, I know, one, I've got an expectation the transaction's going to work. Like that's the first thing. And then two, I know that merchant has been vetted, and I know if something goes wrong, like there's going to be a set of clear rules and processes in place, to make that right. And I think what that does is that lowers the mental transaction cost, where if I see something I like, I just buy it. I don't have to think about the payment. It fades into the background. And I think that the challenge that stablecoins have right now, which is just kind of the general property of crypto, in being a open, public, permissionless network that anyone can interact with, it doesn't solve that trust problem where, take x402, for example, anyone can create an endpoint on x402. And so if your agent is looking to transact, with a merchant, they can find an endpoint. Well, what if that endpoint is run by a company that you don't want to interact with, that you don't want to pay? And, maybe that's, someone that's in a sanctioned, country. Maybe that's somebody that, is unlawfully, selling what those goods are. Like there's nothing stopping someone from standing up a merchant endpoint. What if I buy something from that endpoint and I don't get what I bought? What could I do? What prevents that, from happening again, to somebody else? What if that merchant endpoint isn't even selling a good or service? What if that merchant endpoint is just malicious software that's trying to get me to interact with it so it can prompt eject me? Like there are all of these things that when you have a completely open, permissionless ecosystem, while it's great that it brings people on and enables any individual could stand up a merchant endpoint, I think it's really important if you're actually going to scale commerce to know that you can trust that merchant endpoint. And so that's what we're really focused on, of like, how do you add a trust perimeter and kind of a trusted layer and network that can then sit on top of those protocols? And I think that's the role that Visa plays. And then, on the other hand, I'm a crypto guy. I've been in crypto for close to 10 years now. And I get nervous about giving agents a stablecoin wallet. There are just fewer controls that are in place, and an agent managing a private key, and what happens if things go wrong? The money's gone. It's a bare asset. There's nothing I can do. Being able to give an agent a card, we believe, is a better experience, because you can have controls at the CLI wallet layer, you can have controls at the issuing layer, you can have controls at the network layer. And so you just have these multiple lines of defense that prevent this scenario of you just lose all your money, which I think we're in this point where it's the frontier. People are trying a bunch of things out. But if this is actually going to go mainstream, there's more of a need than ever for trust and for a place that the merchants can be trusted, and that that if something goes wrong, there are protections in place to prevent that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you guys have basically decades of this trust to lean onto, and at the same time, embracing these new novel primitives like x402 and some of the other agentic commerce infrastructure. With that in mind, if you were not at Visa, and let's say you're a builder, knowing what Visa is doing in the space, what would you not build?
What would you not build? Interesting. I think a lot more about what people should build. I think it's very, very hard to build new payment networks and to build that trust and acceptance that has taken us decades to do. And so anytime someone says, okay, I've got a better technology, it's faster and cheaper and it's programmable, so we're going to displace Visa. And Visa's value, only a small fraction of it is the technology. It's how do you coordinate and get the largest entities in the world to align on a single set of rules and standards, and to cooperate around those while still competing with each other. That's a much harder thing to do. And so I think that the trust and coordination piece is not something that, a startup that is, a single entity, is able to really solve, at a global scale. I think it makes a lot more sense to be on one side or the other of the network. I think there's a massive opportunity in building new merchant endpoints and creating what are the next generation of headless merchants. I think you could take a look at pretty much every SaaS service out there, and over some time, many of those services are going to have to go headless. They're going to have to become accessible and be kind of thin, super lightweight, easy endpoints that you can then purchase inside of any agent harness that you want to be in. And I think the interesting question is going to be, well, are some of those SaaS providers going to kind of decapitate themselves and go headless and say, all right, we're going to meet customers there, and we're seeing Salesforce and some others. But I think that there's SaaS in the kind of the software market is so big that there will be plenty of incumbents that, they just can't operate in that structure. It's just, it's not the core model that they were built for of, seat-based pricing and enterprise sales and like fancy dinners and like that. That's like a lot of how software is sold. And so I think there's this huge opportunity to create, valuable software products that are just built for agents, on day one, that are these headless merchants that are accessible, over those protocols. So I think that's like one of the biggest opportunities, right now. And then I think the other piece of it, which I'm curious what you've seen, is a lot of the x402 endpoints today, I think are like a single tool. And I think at the end of the day, it's a lot harder to sell a tool than it is to sell a workflow. And so I think it's really, how do you combine together and compose different services and different endpoints to create something that is a lot easier for people to understand and consume. And I think we're still in this phase of there are thousands of tools, but a lot of people don't really know how to use them. And so can you actually, even if it's starting with the existing x402 endpoints out there, create a product that combines those endpoints into an actual workflow and then being able to sell that workflow. I think those are two of the biggest opportunities right now for earlier stage companies to be able to come in and have an impact.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I definitely agree with you. At least the value that I've seen for x402 right now, today, is mostly on the prospecting side. So if you're trying to, find emails or customers or phone numbers, etc., the value is there, but it's still super long tail. And to your point of the opportunity, I know Merit Systems, who makes Agent Cash, and Locust Pay. Locust Pay is like a YC agent pay provider, same as Agent Cash. They both are basically bundling endpoints to have like these specialized services. So if it's like, social media services, then it bundles like all these different social media platforms, or, prospecting, and it bundles. But I haven't seen the workflow itself of basically giving the agent a skill, I guess. So they are doing the skills, but there's no kind of like robust packaging of this that I've seen so far. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So I think that's super consistent with, I've had a bunch of conversations in the last 2 weeks with, different merchant endpoint providers. And I think that's a common theme of, it's like go to market and sales, prospecting, generating leads like that. That's one of the areas that there is some kind of real, very early organic traction. And so I think it's a natural direction to go to try and stitch together endpoints into a workflow or something that a salesperson can use. So I think that's on the supply side. On the demand side, I think right now that's kind of the bigger problem, of just there's not a ton of easy demand coming into these endpoints, despite there are some like very useful endpoints. And so the question is like, how do you 100x the growth of the demand side of people that can access and kind of pay as they go? And I think there are a few different approaches that are being tried. And I think one approach is we'll just create new front-end interfaces. And I love what Merit is doing with Poncho. I think that's a super interesting interface that is like a harness that's kind of built in of being able to run these workflows. TripStack and others, they have their own front end. And so there are a bunch of people trying to like create their own front end to then drive demand into their endpoints. But I think that one of the challenges is like you have to abstract crypto away to be able to get to a number of mainstream developers and users. And so we're spending a lot of time just trying to figure out how do you both enable someone to just put a card on file and be able to access any of these endpoints, at least the ones that we think are trusted and vetted and can be good services. Mm-hmm. And then how do you get that embedded inside every agent harness out there. And I think we're still in such an early stage where most of the agent harnesses, like, you can't pay for anything outside of the harness. It's like the only thing that you can do inside Cloud Code is pay for Anthropic credits. The only thing you do inside Codex is like, pay for OpenAI credits. And I think it's a matter of time before you see both a number of emerging competitive harnesses, and whether that's open source ones and Hermes and Open Code and others, that are going to make it easier to access like the broader universe of third-party models and tools, natively inside that harness, as well as eventually the larger ones kind of opening up to that. And so, I think that the supply is further along than the demand, but our goal is just how do we grow the overall ecosystem, and how can Visa use our platform, our distribution, our trust, and just the fact everyone has a Visa card, to be able to get more people having a card on file in a place that could then access this kind of growing universe of endpoints being created.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from the enterprise side, just your work so far, and you talking to these merchants. And just to be clear, there's the end user is probably an individual, or maybe a company, an individual at a company using an agent like Cloud Code, right? That has the ability to pay for services. For the service providers themselves and the folks that you're talking about on the enterprise side, what are you noticing regarding their kind of behaviors and thoughts about agentic commerce? Are they kind of adversarial, or are they nervous about bringing their products onto the platform for agents? What are you seeing so far?
I think there's a big separation between developer-facing merchants and enterprises and traditional kind of consumer-facing merchants. I think on the consumer-facing merchant side, it's a lot earlier, and there's just a lot more questions. And like there's like a FOMO of, we want to be involved if people start using their agents to help them shop. But there's like real risk of, a lot of the value of a lot of merchants is their storefront, their website, their experience, their app. And I think that there's this question of like, okay, well, what does it mean to open up and let an agent be able to transact with me? How do I control the end experience and the brand? And, how do I decide which agents? It's much easier to say, let me just, try and embed inside ChatGPT and not have like anyone's Hermes like showing up to my store. And so I think that's one of the reasons we've been focused on kind of this idea of like the trusted agent protocol of like, how can you have some level of identity, to an agent, know who the agent is, and be able to have a signature that, they've been vetted, by Visa when they show up to a merchant. Because I think right now it's either kind of closed loop, get embedded inside ChatGPT, which isn't easy to do. And like, that there's been kind of stops and starts to that. Or it's you're letting everybody in. If you're letting everybody in, like, what does that mean? You don't, have a lot of control. And so I think that there's a lot of work to do to find kind of more of a middle ground. I think protocols like UCP are playing a big role, and like that's still early, and I think has to get built out more. On the developer-facing merchant side, I think there's just a lot more willingness to experiment and to say that like every developer is using a coding agent, and I need to like meet them where they are. And I need to be able to have an interface that they can interact with me. I think one of the challenges right now is that the way x402 was built, it's a guest checkout. That's the only experience. It's like every agent that shows up to an endpoint, gets the same pricing, the same product. Endpoints are very static, and it's hard to like really understand who that customer is and serve that customer really well. So I think we need to see more of an evolution towards dynamic endpoints. These merchants, like they want to know who's the customer, what's their email, be able to communicate with them. In the future, maybe there's different pricing or different endpoints that would be exposed to some customers and not others. And so I think that there's so much more that could exist in terms of enabling not just a guest checkout kind of one-time experience, but a like true headless, any agent inside any harness being able to pay for any developer service, but having the developer service still have a relationship and be able to interact with that agent. I don't think that really exists yet. But I think that it's more likely of like, I like to ask the question of like, where's the first $1 billion of agentic commerce like going to be spent? Mm-hmm. And I think that, one, I'd argue like there's already billions of dollars that's spent of agents buying tokens. It's just an agent, inside of a single platform buying tokens of the single platform. And so when are you going to have like an open $1 billion spent of an agent inside one platform buying something from another platform? And I think it's much likely to be inference and kind of very developer facing, kind of agent facing services than it is to be shopping assistants like in the near term. And so that's why like I'm very focused on the developer space.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. And the reason you're focused on the developer side is because there's already one demand. There's some visual of demand there, and they're more receptive on the enterprise side.
Yeah, I think it's the best use case for an agent to date. Like, what are people using agents to do? They're using agents to code and build. Like, that is by far to me the area of just agents that are doing productive economic activity. Like, and the scale at which agents are coding is so much greater than the scale at which agents are serving as shopping assistants. Yeah. And so I think that whatever protocols and networks and products and solutions that can help solve for making it easier for agents to pay for the things that they need as they code, I think that's like the beachhead and the first place that agentic payments really happens. And then once an agent has a really good way to pay for an open marketplace of services that needs as they code, it probably makes sense for that also to be used to pay for ordering DoorDash or whatever it is that the developer needs in addition. And so I think it's a lot of the other agentic commerce could end up being built on top of what the developer facing use cases are. And we'll see, but we just want to be in the ecosystem where people are using agents, and that's developers right now.
Yeah, right now I think there's like this looming overhang, and maybe people want to like pull the curtain back and look at it, at the ghost or the boogeyman in the closet. But I kind of get this feeling that there are these large incumbents, similar to yourself at Visa or like Stripe or even Anthropic themselves, right? Or Cloudflare. There's like these huge infrastructure providers or network providers that can just like turn the lights on. And I would say like for a builder, what's scary is if Anthropic just, works with Cloudflare and then they just enable wallets to purchase on like all these different websites, right? Do you think that path can happen where just, in a month, we just see like all these transactions because two large institutions just turned on the lights? Or do you think it's going to be more of this kind of movement or like slush of supply and demand and activity to kind of a longer term thing of agentic commerce?
Yeah, I think personally it's much more likely, to be this kind of back and forth and like, bottoms up, some emerging new use cases from new players, and then that, people learn from, and then the large players kind of adapt those. I think it's very rarely in new markets, like this, something that, it doesn't exist and then overnight in a month, and now it exists like at scale. And I think everyone is kind of learning from each other and experimenting and testing things out. And I think in many ways it's easier for small players, to experiment and be nimble and kind of find, the early signs of where there's demand, and then, larger players, come into the space after that. So, I think it'll be a give and a take. Mm-hmm. I think the first market to me that is going to be really, really interesting to watch is just like what happens with token share on inference, which I think is going to be one of the most important trends like over the next 6 to 12 months. And like the feeling that I have, and I don't know if you share the same thing, is it's almost like there was this phase of like coding agents emerged, and Claude Code to me was like, that was my moment of like, whoa, like I can build anything with this, like this is incredible, it's like the best product I've ever used. And then there was this like honeymoon of like everyone just vibe coding, just like building anything, and I'm spending hundreds of dollars a day and I don't even care because like I'm like coding now. And so you go from this like token maxing mentality that I think was very much driven by Claude Code and Codex. Like those are the platforms that people they're using and are experiencing the magic of having a coding agent, towards then waking up with a bit of a hangover saying, how much did I spend on tokens over the last few months? And like, what do I have to show for it? And like, was there ROI on that? And like one thing I was just talking to some people about today is, if you think about inference as like a new merchant and like product category, like it's a product, it's a SKU, you're buying inference, you're buying intelligence. There aren't that many analogs of, you don't know the cost of it until after you use it. So it's like you show up to a store and you're like, okay, I'd like to, or a service, I'd like to do this. And they're like, okay, like, we're going to do it. And then, we'll send you the bill for what it costs after. And you're like, well, like I was just trying to set up an agentic workflow to like download some podcasts. I didn't realize it was gonna be $100 that like this agent got like stuck in a loop and it was doing all these things it probably shouldn't have done. Yeah. And so I think just the kind of push towards how do you justify the ROI and be able to measure and track, like me personally, like I want like a mint.com for token spend. It's just like, I want to know everything I can, about how do I lower the cost of my token spend, getting as much value and like measure that ROI. But then you have this like structural conflict that, if you're Anthropic or if you're OpenAI, like it's not in your interest to like make it super easy for people to like reduce and optimize their token spend by routing away to like cheaper models. You want everything to be going, through your models. And so then you see like, the open source harnesses, start to emerge. And I think companies like OpenRouter are building amazing products to have like a single integration that can then give you access to 200 plus models. And then does that get embedded more into these different harnesses? And, I think you could do that on Hermes now. You could do that on OpenCode. And so I think you'll see more of this decoupling of, agent harnesses that are like model agnostic, that are like built to be more ROI driven, and then access many models and tools instead of this first phase of the market where it's like the harness and the model, they're kind of coupled one to one. And anytime you're using that harness, you're using that same model. And it's just very hard to justify like buying frontier tokens for very basic coding tasks. But the problem is that it hasn't been easy to like orchestrate and like have access to a broader universe of many, many models that are out there. So I think that's one of the first use cases where, like, again, agentic commerce is happening of agents buying tokens. Mm-hmm. They've just been in this kind of environment where they're only buying tokens from one store that has one price. If you give agents the ability to help optimize and have services and products that let them buy tokens from many stores, they can then optimize the prices that they're getting and the value from that. And so I think that's one of the first areas that I could see. And I think that the total value and the amount of money that's spent on agents buying tokens is likely to be bigger than agents buying everything else combined. Because it's like, that's the lifeblood of like, an agent has to buy a token to run. And so sure, it's got to buy some data, it's got to buy some other things, but like, if you can really figure out how to make it easier for agents to buy tokens, I think that's going to be a really interesting space.
Yeah, wow. I really like that illustration. I'm going to try to summarize. So basically, a huge opportunity you see is agents buying their own inference or kind of like energy into stimulating the harness and the model. And right now you're saying that there's like this opacity where it comes to pricing and only one customer or one merchant, which is like Anthropic or OpenAI. And with these open source models, they're giving you all these different options. And the new harnesses like Hermes, I know they allow you to basically adjust the model depending on the task. So essentially you're saying if the agents have this open marketplace in which they can be more efficient in selecting the correct models to use for the correct tasks, then you think that right there is one of the biggest use cases for agentic commerce.
Yeah. And I think this concept of model orchestration is really interesting. Of like, how do you find the right task for the right model? And I think there are only going to be more models that exist that could be specialized and potentially better at certain tasks, but could also do those tasks at a lower cost. But the problem is today, it's pretty hard. Most people who are vibe coding don't have a router that's automatically set up in whatever harness they're using that is automatically picking the right model for the right task. I think that's kind of like an inevitable direction that it should go, and that I think developers should want some type of intelligent router that's helping to pick the right model for the right task and having access to an inventory of many, many models that are out there. And I think that's going to be one part of how do you optimize token spend and justify the cost of it, the ROI. And to me, that is an agentic commerce use case. Yeah. It's an agent that is buying inference or also buying data and tools. And I've just been like, as I go down the rabbit hole, like there's so many things I'm learning where there are plenty of times where if you have access to the right tools, you don't even have to pay for inference, because the tools can go and kind of do certain types of work and store that data locally that you can come back to instead of having to run it through a model. And so I think there's so much room to optimize just the core like back end guts of how an agent operates in writing code. And I think that if you just unpack like agents are going to write more and more software in the future. If that goes from, well, the agent spends at one merchant of the platform that they're on to like the agent is spending at thousands of merchants and being able to access these different tools, like I think that could be like one of the early agentic commerce markets that's very interesting to look at.
Interesting, like self fill up or like self charging for vehicles.
Yeah, and I think more competition of being able to, because if you're building a new model, you might have a model that's really good at a certain task. How do you then go and reach customers? And so it's like this new two-sided network problem where it's like you have agent harnesses on one side, and then you have models and tools on the other side. And in an ideal kind of efficient universe, any agent inside any harness should be able to access, discover, and find any model or any tool that could help them do their job and be able to pay for it as they go. To me, that's how it ought to be. Like there are a lot of things to to actually get there, but if you work backwards from like a few years from now, like I think that would be a more natural market state. But you're going to need new payment infrastructure and solutions and products that can enable both the discovery, the orchestration, the payment, the authorization, like the estimate. Like there are all these things that need to happen for that like open ecosystem to be able to emerge.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. One thing that comes to my mind as you're saying that is like that piece right there, the agent, to put in like a one-liner, agent paying for its own inference, just opens like a science fiction, maybe not science fiction, probably not science fiction, like thoughts about agents just running around autonomously and self-improving. I know Anthropic just published a report, paper yesterday about the agents improving themselves and being able to get to the point of continuous improvement and development. So yeah, I just want to flag that does creep
But
me out
I
a
think
little bit.
it kind of departs from the crypto. Like there's a crypto world, and like I think the crypto AI world and like BitTensor, like it's like a fascinating ecosystem, and it like feels like it's like science fiction. Like they're like, but I don't understand most of it. But I think there's this idea of like self-sovereign agents that you're gonna have an agent that is going to pay as it goes for its own inference, and then it's going to have to like create value, or else it's not going to be able to pay for it. It's like that's the like vision people paint.
Yeah.
I think that is a very scary future, and that's one of the reasons why it's like we think agents should be working for and accountable, to a developer or an individual, and you should be able to tie those two together. And if you're going to interact with an agent, you should probably want to know, who that agent is actually working for, instead of that agent is just working for itself, in self-improving towards some goal. And so it's kind of like my pet peeve is anytime someone says, yeah, agents are going to have to use crypto and stablecoins because they're not going to be able to go and get bank accounts. And I think the truth is that, well, in almost all cases, an agent is created and works for an individual who's a consumer or business, and that consumer or business can get a bank account and already has a bank account and a card. And so it's just about delegating and giving those credentials to the agent like you would an employee. I think the only case where that's not the case is that the agent is self-sovereign and is created and kind of let go into the wild, and they're not working for anyone. And in that scenario, that's terrifying. And like, I think that it's very hard to be like, oh yeah, let's go and like support this agent that, reports to nobody. And like, it's just out there in the wild, and let's sell it a bunch of things when we don't know what its objectives are. Like, I think most merchants would look at that and say, that seems like that's pretty high risk. Like, I'd rather sell to an agent that I know is being operated and controlled by someone who has a bank account and a card that, there's some accountability on.
Yeah. I appreciate you posing it that way, because I think like for navigating this space, everyone has like their mental models, and you might get stuck in a mental model either from like reading stuff or just kind of information just pounding you on the head all day, and you can get stuck in those like ideologies, and then you just literally cannot see the forest, right? At the end of the day. So it just reminds me also, when I was growing up, my parents got me like a kid's account at the bank, and that was my first account. And I had that like kids account, bank account, debit card, but it was tied to their account. And once I hit 18, then it graduated me to my own account, right? So I can also see that happening. And we talked to WorkOS, and they have a similar structure for doing credentialing and authentication for agents on websites. They launched auth.md.
Yeah.
And yeah, they have the same kind of mindset where they allow the agent to maybe like anonymously interact with the website, but then later the website might require the agent to like bring a human or an email or something like that. So I'm kind of seeing like pattern parallels between on the website authentication side and on the payment side for how you're looking at the space.
Yeah, I think that the analogy is almost like just from like a very, very simple sense of every individual can now be their own corporation, where like corporation, has a set of employees, and then those employees are delegated certain responsibilities and certain budgets and certain amounts of money, and those employees can go and do things, but like they're accountable back to the corporation. And now that's like every consumer can have as many agents as they want working for them, doing different things with different roles and responsibilities. And I think to me, that's awesome. Like that's what gets me really excited is like, for, a pretty small accessible amount, depending upon like what the agents are doing, being able to have your own fleet of agents that are working for you and like, doing different productive tasks. And so I don't think it's like that different from that idea of, every individual being a company.
Yeah. Cool. And you touched on the TAP or the Trusted Agent Protocol. And the Trusted Agent Protocol is like a subsidiary under your Visa Intelligence Commerce like platform, right? Which is like agents in commerce. Can you explain the VIC or Visa Intelligence Commerce stack and then where like TAP fits in there?
Yeah, I think at a high level, like Visa Intelligent Commerce, enables agents to be able to have access to a card that is tokenized, that's secure, that can have certain controls and permissions, can be identified as an agent. And so the payment functionality is pretty straightforward that we're able to solve using a lot of the infrastructure that Visa's kind of built out in tokenization and some of the same technology that powers Apple Pay. You can now be able to use as an agent, that someone puts a card on file, you tokenize the card so you have a secure representation of it that an agent can have access to with certain guardrails and bounds around it. So I think that was like the first thing. Like, okay, if an agent's gonna have a card, you shouldn't just give it a 16-digit PAN. Like, there should be a tokenized representation of the card that is more secure that the agent can have. So I think that's the first thing. I think then the question is, okay, well, like that agent needs to be able to take that card and go somewhere and spend. And I think the very real challenge that we saw was that a lot of merchants, particularly like when we started this a year ago, it's a lot of merchants just block bots. Like bots are bad. Like they've like for the entirety of the internet, it's been if a bot shows up at a website, like it's there doing something you probably don't want it to do. And so I think that merchants it's one thing to just give an agent a card, but like how do you help that agent kind of be able to get to a checkout and then be able to spend on the checkout? And I think that's kind of the gap and the barrier in the space right now. And part of it is that merchants and through providers like Cloudflare and CDNs, they have all these things in place that are specifically set up to block bots. How do you differentiate between a good bot and a bad bot? And so what we're doing is kind of building this identity system in TAP, where if you have an agent that has a card that has been tokenized through Visa Intelligent Commerce, being able to then have a signature that agent can carry. And so then when they show up at a website, being able to say that this is a trusted agent that merchant should let in versus this is a bot that's there trying to do something malicious. So I think that's the high level concept. I think we're making a ton of progress on it, but it's still incredibly early for most merchants. And I think that right now, the bigger challenge is how do agents discover inventory and be able to have merchants identify good agents, bad agents, and let them get to the checkout. If an agent can get to the checkout, like now agents can have a tokenized card. If they can get to the checkout, like they can pay, but it's that like in between layer. Yeah. And so we think there's a big role for TAP to play. We think there's a big role for UCP. I think there are going to be a number of kind of protocols and standards that have to exist to enable like a headless checkout that also has trust and identity built into it. So that's like the core stack right now. And then, what I've been focused on is building out Visa CLI, where Visa CLI is very much, rather than focused on, traditional kind of e-commerce, agentic use cases, Visa CLI is like a very developer, vibe coder native. If you're inside a coding platform, how can you put a card on file and then be able to buy inference, buy image generation, buy data. And so Visa CLI is kind of closer to the x402 space, where we're actually trying to enable a card-based experience to pay for x402 endpoints. I think in the future, all these pieces will come together. And what I'd like to see is you could have an agent, wherever that agent is, they can put a card on file. They can get a trusted kind of signature that they're a good agent through Tap. They could then spend any traditional e-commerce checkout over maybe a protocol like UCP, or they could go buy inference and buy data. And I think you'll see different use cases where, like, you want to book travel. Well, maybe you want to buy some weather data first, and you want to do some like small microtransaction, and then that ultimately leads to completing a larger transaction. And so I think that you kind of need to have a set of primitives in infrastructure that can support across the board everything from developer-facing micropayments all the way up to like executing a traditional e-commerce payment, at the point of sale, with an agent. So we're trying to just build that kind of core layer across the stack.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. It feels to me like now, and it's still super early, just even on the payment side. And there's like all these things that need to happen. But for the people who are like running at full speed and at the edge, it seems like the real break is the distance between the agent and traversing the website to get to the checkout. That just seems like there's a few companies like Browser Use or Browser Base that are like actually just using the human browser interface to get to the checkouts. Can you kind of explain a little bit more if you think that, in my experience, that's kind of the big gap right now? More on your end of like where you think that's going to tighten up, or even if you think that is a gap in the first place.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a gap. I think that like most of agentic commerce, experiments and pilots and kind of early versions of it has been requiring an agent to navigate a website like a human. I'm interested to see how browser use and like computer use, like how all of that improves, but it doesn't seem like it has gotten to the point today that works well enough, efficiently enough at a low cost to be able to actually make that a mainstream use case. So I don't know, like it could change, it could get much better, but like today that hasn't been kind of the sole solution that everyone said, great, we can just use browser use and get to any checkout that we want. And there are a bunch of nuances of the way checkouts work at many different merchants that you run into issues when you just try and do browser use. I think having purpose-built protocols like UCP make more sense of like a headless checkout that is API based, that you don't have to send an agent over the browser. And so I think that you'll see like a combination of both, but I see a need for like these specific protocols that are built for a merchant to be able to communicate with an agent without the agent having to go over the site. And I'm excited to see more merchants start to onboard into those protocols, start to learn how to use them. And I don't know how far away we are, but I think that there's a good recognition across the industry that merchants that want to sell to agents are going to have to do some work. And many times their platform like Shopify has enabled and kind of makes it very easy to do. They're going to have to represent their inventory, make it easy for agents to discover, and then be able to execute payments through those protocols. And that's probably a more sustainable long-term solution than browser automation. But we'll see. I don't think anybody knows. Like, it's great to have people trying a bunch of approaches.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting with stuff like Shopify or these platforms, because you're probably going to have like real world market makers, doing like algorithmic trading for goods. And I'm curious to see like what emerges as it's easier. You can like machine interact with all these different platforms, machine to machine. So
I think that's one of the reasons that merchants are nervous, that they're like, are we just going to put all of our inventory into this protocol and now we just become a catalog as an API and we lose our brand, it's a scary thing, to give up, which is partially why I think there's a big opportunity for new merchants. And I think like more often people, when they think about agentic commerce, they think about existing merchants, making, products available, to agents. And that's, to me, almost like it's like the internet's coming around, and how are existing brick and mortar retailers going to adapt and making products available to users on the internet. And I think that it usually starts with like some success cases of brand new merchants, brand new retailers, brand new companies that are just built on day one. Their entire business model their entire mission and vision is selling to agents. And I think they're the ones that have the incentive to go and try and figure this out. And then you have some breakthrough successes, and then what they do gets adapted, and that the traditional merchants that have big e-commerce franchises today, they start to open up over time. But it's just so hard for me to imagine that it's going to be an existing merchant that has a great business that they like in a format that they understand, that is going to be on the bleeding edge in terms of experimentation around how to sell to agents versus just a new merchant class that's emerging. And I think the barrier to entry to building a merchant is just getting lower and lower. And I think that's one of the amazing things about vibe coding. It's like anyone in an hour can build something that they could then sell online. And so I think that there'll just be many new merchants that are created. And I think some of those merchants will take an approach to say, we're going to build exclusively for agents. Maybe there's no way a human can even pay at them. Maybe they don't even have a website. Like, it's just an endpoint, but we're going to build for agents. And I think that once you start to get some success cases there, then more traditional merchants will say, okay, let's dive in. But it's just hard for that to start with a traditional merchant.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It reminds me quite a bit of like ghost kitchens and just, this new entrant of player. I don't know if ghost kitchens are a success case, but very similar kind of parallel there. Kai, all the stuff that you've been saying so far has been kind of putting this model and giving us this example of what to look out for. In the ecosystem right now, where do you think, as we wrap here, what do you think is the last place where alpha lives? And, if you were a new builder, where would you focus on right now?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple advice that I give to everyone that I talk to now is like, the best way to understand agentic payments and where it's going is to just start making agentic payments and just start using these products. And like, I've been trying to buy something, with an agent every day, and just like, what are interesting things that I could go out and try and buy? How does it work? Where does it break? And I think that's where the alpha is. And like, there's so many people who, just want to talk about agentic. And then you ask them, like, have you ever bought anything with an agent? Like, are you using any agents? They're like, no. It's just like, you can talk forever, but it's like, you have to just use the products. And as you use the products, you figure out what works and what doesn't, and then you iterate from there. So that's my advice.
Cool. Well, cool, man. Thanks for sharing. And I'd love to have you back on soon.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. See ya.